All right. So I have Andrew Flores with me today on this God Talk series. So I'm happy, Andrew, you could join me.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, if you could just briefly introduce yourself. I know I think you used to be in the Navy. Are you out
Mhm.
now?
Yeah, I got out recently. So, like, for those who may not know who I am, my name's again Andrew Flores, but I also go by the online name, the Big Sig or the Big Sig for short. And it's both my YouTube channel where I talk about Lacan and psychoanalysis and Marxism, Protean Marxism, and then my other channel, which I co-host, called the Vanishing Mediators, where we kind of consider ourselves neither really a podcast or like a stream, but more of like an online cartel for works in psychoanalytic theory, and studies in Marxist theory as well. But primarily, we are going through all the seminars of Jacques Lacan. We're finishing up seminar 3, and we're going to be starting 4 soon. So that's like a bit about what I do. But yeah, like as far as like, anything as far as like introduction wise, yeah, I was in the Navy for about 8 years. I got out recently, and I'm just kind of like waiting for like the VA to get all my benefits going through, the VA goes, and then, looking to start school and all that. But yeah, I mean, on my free time, I just study philosophy, study psychoanalysis, and yeah, I mean, this series that you just like said is the God Talk. So it's about like my relationship with religion. I am a practicing Catholic, but as far as like my attendance in church, because of my political views, have been very scarce. But I do kind of want to go back. It's just kind of like learning how to maintain that sort of discernment and distance from it because of my position in radical politics. But with that being said, yeah, I am a practicing Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic, but being a Mexican American, in California or in Texas, you're predominantly going to be Catholic. It's just a part of like, our blood. So on both sides of my family, uh, there's traditional roots in Catholic or Catholicism, but my parents never really raised me on it. I pretty much came from a working class background. Parents ex gang members, and then they just trying to raise a good family, but they never really pushed religion onto us. And we tried going to a couple churches, and there were like some evangelical ones or like those non-denominational ones, and I never liked it. My mom was more religious than my dad was, and one of the things that my dad would like to do, because of our family friend who was big into like other forms of religion, who then became an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian. But during that time, he was going to these Buddhist temples. So that kind of like religion, even though I wasn't raised religious and I didn't like praying, I didn't like going to church. I just thought it was weird. I thought that people were hypocritical at like an early age. I was fascinated by like Buddhism and Asian culture. And then when I got into philosophy, the first theologian I read was Augustine. And even though like I was not like a Christian or any sorts, like I loved reading Augustine, Plotinus. So like I was deep into like the mystical thinkers. Buddhism was really big, and it was something that I wanted to practice just because it was just something that like you could do, just meditate on your own. And so like during that time of getting into like Western philosophy, I was like studying like some Buddhism, some even like the Western esotericism from like the alchemy tradition, Hermeticism, whatever I could get my hands on. And but yeah, Catholicism, or just my interest in Christianity as a practice, came quite recently. I would say like the summer or the springtime of 2023. I was dating somebody who was Episcopalian, and came to that on their choice. They weren't raised religious, and they were also interested in like not liberation theology, but these sort of like derivatives of theology that used a lot of like Levinas, Butler, Baudrillard, that were kind of like inspired off of like deconstruction theology from John Caputo, and more like stuff that was like not necessarily. I kind of introduced them to Caputo, but because it was recommended to me by a friend, but they were more interested in this sort of like inclusive theology that was more like critical of like the gender binaries and stuff like that. And then I started going to church more, but Catholicism seemed to be calling me. And so like I decided to go to the Catholic church that was right by where I was living in Virginia while I was still active duty. And I just decided to go. And I think to go that route. And I think what also helped was during that time, you probably know him. He's pretty popular for the book that was introduced in the Palgraves. It's Directions on Desire, Lacan and St. John of the Cross, Mark Gerard Murphy. I got in touch with him, and he's my spiritual director, mentor, and good friend, who's also working class, raised Catholic, and Marxist, left-leaning politics, and very big into not only Lacan, but also deep into analytic theology. And so with his help and with our meetings kind of like helped me guide me to like have a sort of open and critical lens to my process as a Catholic, because he's got his own gripes with Catholicism as well, but also the discourse in theology and the way that mysticism and the mystical has been sort of collapsed into experientialism, and the sort of way that we kind of see spirituality take the form in today's age of like having to feel it, having to experience it, the sensuality of it, where that's not at all what like mystical and apophatic theology is. It's more of a negative practice of deep contemplation, what God is not what God is, but what is not, and kind of tethering with the via negativia of God.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I actually have his book. I have like a PDF version.
Yeah, it's a really good book too. Yeah.
No, yeah, it really is. I haven't like finished reading it. I mean, I've been trying to find a time to read it, but I did get to the parts where he was critical on experientialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I totally agree, because I mean, a lot of the conversation going around is, I mean, that's like my big caveat is mysticism. If it's reduced to an experience, we're kind of missing the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not like, even in Buddhism, they kind of teach you like whatever you're experiencing is also not the point.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to. That's why the praxis itself is the point. The praxis itself is the point versus the whatever you're gathering or whatever you're encountering in the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why like I'm so hesitant and that's why I'm like, I debate whether like mysticism should be the word sometimes, because then it's so conflated with the kind of experience.
Yeah.
Or
like
people try
the
to
psychedelic community then uses that
yes,
as like, some type of like transcendental like hallucination or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and like people like it becomes this kind of like attraction where people want ego death, when in reality you don't get like a permanent ego death. You just get like it's always a momentary thing. You it's the present, right? If you can die in the now, then you can die in the now, but you still have to die again and again and again. So it's kind of a the aim of ego death is kind of not the point, even though it is the means. Why is it the means? Oh, it's the means because you're trying to cultivate something. And Buddhism and Christianity will differ on some of those things, but fundamentally it's about virtue. It's centered on virtue. But yeah, no, I really like this framing that you got with the Catholicism. So on Catholicism, what was I mean, I know Lacan has interest in Catholicism, and I know he has like a background in it. I wonder how much of that was an influence on your decision or curiosity in Catholicism.
Yeah, and yeah, I think maybe that does play into a fact too. And like most of the philosophers and thinkers that I like outside of Lacan were also Catholic oriented. But I think mainly, being under analysis the question of religion came up, so I think that was a sort of pushing factor to kind of just like just accept that aspect and kind of embody that. Questions of religion, and so it was from there on that like I just decided to, I'm just gonna go. Like I know that like I'm not gonna be like sort of brainwashed. I know I'm aware of like my reasons for wanting to go and practice,
Mhm.
and taking that into account, and my reasons for going, or just because I have like question like theological, you could say for lack of a better term, existential questions about my life and where I'm going.
Mhm.
And like even if I tried it like as hard to be an atheist, I don't know, like for me it was like it felt more inauthentic in my life to be atheistic, to kind of put it bluntly.
Mm.
I felt like
Mhm.
I was lying to myself more,
Mhm.
it's kind of funny. You'd think it's the opposite. But like I think, yeah, for me, and like the way just like personally like my life played out, and like I think some of the things I've been fortunate enough, and sort of even the way I've like retroactively looked at it and like see my life plan out, and like all the good things beyond all the terrible things that I've been through and suffered, that I feel like uh it was not like it was too good to be true, but I felt like there's a sort of divine blessing that
Mhm.
and to put it in Catholic terms, like being interceded, or God pouring out His grace, and the more I continue to not just go to church, but really to practice, and I think this helped from my foot in the door with Buddhism, with meditation, which I practiced a lot when I was in the Navy, um, and Qigong, which is more from the Taoist side, and the breathing exercises, and that actually was introduced to me because of my martial arts background. So like I think there was like a sort of like conjunction with that, but making prayer like in meditation like a one like a unison thing became more of my practice, and I felt like I wasn't getting those experiences like, oh, I prayed, now I feel the grace of God on me. But I felt like retroactively and like reflecting back and contemplating, I felt like the more I prayed, like I think it's I think it's Kierkegaard that says like don't pray to God to give you something, but like pray to God to change yourself, or something like that.
Mhm.
And I definitely butchered the hell out of the quote, but the point is like my prayer and intention is more about like not asking God to fix me or to give me whatever, but rather as a more of a dialogue, a conversation, a personal conversation. And I think, to go back to your question regarding psychoanalysis, I think also the act of free associating, in a sense, can be turned into praying. And so like saying whatever's on my mind, can't say everything, and so I'm saying whatever's on my mind in a sort of holy and sacred form, because I've kind of put all of my attention and awareness onto um, the word of God, or whatever God is not, pretty much, and
Mhm.
focus on that. um, so that's more of like, not necessarily, maybe not like sort of uh theologically sophisticated, but it's more like my sort of spiritual awareness of my practice, and my relationship to the divine, and still keeping those fundamental tenets, because like I'll say whatever's on my mind and really take it to prayer, but the Catholic part is that I close it with the doxology of our Father, our Hail Marys, and glory be, and the rosary I pray daily too. So that's like, it's not just me praying in a personal form. It's honestly meditating and praying on the rosary in each decade, but then like I'll either start it or end it with a personal note. So yeah, and I think that making that like the fundamental focus has helped me be, not, I guess, like a better Catholic, but also more interested into the more subtle things that you won't learn by going to Sunday Mass every day. And I
Yeah.
feel like some ways that it's become more trivialized and more like worldly, that it forgets those sort of rich history and of the contemplative tradition. And that's why like I feel drawn to like, again, like people like Pseudo Dionysus, the Areopagite. Yeah, who's I mean, I don't know if you know him, but he's like one of
I heard of
the
him. Yeah.
like ancient Christian mystics. Obviously, like, or like honestly, I think he's actually supposed to be the father of apophatic theology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so like he's drawing off from like the mystical contemplative tradition of Neoplatonism from Plotinus, in the same way like Origen would, who's another one. But yeah, there's more of like that sort of apophatic mystical element to Pseudo Dionysus, and then from people like Hildegard, Meister Eckhart, all those cats.
Yeah, I like Master Eckhart a lot. Well, I find this really fascinating because it's funny when you said, you think I'd be an atheist, but like, like that just not, like would be unfaithful to myself. I've had that experience too, actually, where like I kind of fluctuated between atheism. Actually, joining the army was my first opening to like explore other religions.
Yeah, and it's like, it's like, it's weird being in the military. Like, you definitely get overworked, right? And you definitely hate your life majority of the time. But there's also this weird like blend of having a lot of otium, like having a lot of leisure time,
Right.
And some that get it, end up reading a lot more, or like, it gives you a sort of space to like nerd out. If you're like a book nerd or into philosophy, you end up like, and that was me, and I was just reading everything I could.
I did the same thing, and I started noticing that, like, if you didn't take advantage of that leisure time, I mean, the leisure time was just spent kind of just doing drugs or alcohol, basically just military things, what the kind of stereotypical things.
Transgressive and just the typical,
Yeah, and like I started to feel bad because I was like, a lot of these people are like legitimately doing these things because they're struggling with how to relate to, I mean, everything that's going on, just like their personal lives, their military life. And like, it does tempt you after, the military just sort of burning you day by day, to, just take it out on, doing whatever you need to have fun or whatever. But for me, I had like real existential questions. And that's when I got into like Buddhism, because I felt like it was very transgressive for me, because I was kind of taught, I was born Seventh-day Adventist, so that's what's interesting. But I was like always taught that learning other religions, or specifically like Hinduism, for example, many gods kind of concept, which I kind of, started learning later. That's like not entirely correct, but like, how just bad it was to even learn about these things.
Right. And it's like pagan or idolatry, and
right.
You get all that stuff. That's interesting that you were raised Seventh-day Adventist. I actually never knew about that until the Navy, because one of our chaplains was a Seventh-day Adventist, one that we had on deployment. And that's actually another element that I think really drew me to religion, was like, even like when I was kind of like, defying and like learning about like esotericism and the cult and all that stuff. And also like being an atheist, like I used to love going to the chaplains and talking with them, because I think like I had like deeper conversations with chaplains in the Navy than like, with anybody else like during that time. And my mentor on my ship was one of the chaplains. He showed up after deployment, and I think he's a Protestant. But he was like big into like existential thinkers like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky.
Really?
He liked reading some philosophy. He has like a more like minor understanding of like basic philosophy. He wasn't into like French theory or anything like that. But like, I just thought it was also another interesting point to add. But yeah, like that's Yeah, I think with that, like also Buddhism, it's so interesting how like people that are so like disenfranchised and like seeking some type of spirituality end up going to that one. You know, there's something very appealing to the aesthetic of it, honestly. But I mean, it does speak to people on an intuitive level about like suffering.
Yeah, no, it does, and it did for me. Like I went through so many phases, my God. Because I eventually became Muslim at one point too. But yeah, I mean, like Buddhism was one of those things that I was like, wow, like all these religions. I mean, I wasn't studying philosophy yet, but I was already starting to make connections of just like, I think people are kind of wrong on condemning a lot of these
Yeah,
religions. Like I was like, I don't see what's so transgressive about it, what's so problematic about them. And particularly Eastern religions, when we talk about like Daoism, Buddhism, Hinduism,
right.
they don't have as much of an issue with intermixing uh religious practices. Like they don't have a problem with that. It's
No.
only monotheism that generally has a problem with that.
Right, and you know what's so funny too? One is like the Dalai Lama. It was a quote that I saw from him. He was saying that like I know a Catholic or I know a Christian priest, probably a Catholic priest who studied Buddhism and it didn't turn him into a Buddhist at all. Just practicing the Dharma just made him a better Christian.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
so, like you see other people say that, and I've read. I was listening to it, or know where I heard this from, but there's like this interesting statement that someone said that if you went back, or if you took someone from like the Byzantine empire that was a Catholic during that time or an Orthodox, and they came to here, they would not recognize our Christianity and wouldn't think it'd be Christian. In fact, the only people that they would recognize and probably get more, and I guess would feel more related to would be the Muslims and the way that they practice.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
so
that's also
interesting.
true.
It's so interesting. Yeah, I forget where I heard that from. I think it was like a
Interesting.
Catholic podcast or something like that.
That's
Or
interesting.
no, it's this one YouTube channel that I follow that's really good at like talking. I can't think of the name of it right now. But they talk about like the history of like
Oh, is it called
Catholicism.
Let's Talk Religion? I think it's
No,
called
no,
that.
no, no. But I do like him though.
I do like him too.
Yeah, no, he's good. No, he just talks a lot about like the history of like Catholicism, theological notions. He
Okay.
even goes about like the history of the different heresies.
Oh, nice. I'll have to find that channel
Yeah,
then.
I'll have to send you the link to it when I find it eventually. But yeah, no, I think it was that channel.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, the reason why I'm doing these talks again is because like, even though I was kind of going through different religions and stuff and exploring them, um, I keep going through this. I started noticing I keep going through this oscillation where I go really deep into philosophy, and then I start like being disgusted by philosophy, and I'm like, why am I disgusted? And then I'm like, and it's because there's always something pressing on the back of my unconscious where it's like, I'm like, I want to get back into like mysticism, reading like esoteric stuff.
Yeah,
And I realized like I was kind of like intellectualizing too much with it, which is to say that like I was actually like really craving something existential, not like just the knowledge of like these things, even though I like learning about those things for sure. Um, so I recently got cracked by, it's so funny. It was actually a psychoanalytic thinker that brought me to do this kind of re-questioning on God again. And it's actually Marion Milner. I don't know if you've heard of her.
yeah,
She's not like super, like she did some psychoanalysis, but she really didn't do like psychoanalysis like writings. She kind of did like this method. She was able to like, she thought journaling was a way to encounter your unconscious by kind of free associating kind of journaling. And then, but anyways, that book that she wrote before she got became a psychoanalysis. It was called The Life of One's Own, where
Mhm.
she's really like provoking existential questions. And I'm like, I don't know how this woman's gonna come across like this, like what does it mean to live kind of thing. But she really does a whole number on me where towards the end of the book, she goes, it's not about having an answer to the question. It was a question of attention.
Right.
It was a question of self-forgetting yourself enough that those things don't matter, essentially. But the real thing was, what is your object of attention that makes you self-forget? And that was where I was like, oh, that's generally where people talk about God and like mysticism and contemplation and meditation, like this whole idea of basically getting, detachment, right? And self-forgetting. So that was what actually turned me again to this question of God, because I started thinking about it not in like oh, let's prove God exists and then I'll believe, but actually on just this mere argument of attention.
Yeah. From the contemplative tradition, yeah.
Right.
Of just of attention, and you not only lose yourself in the process, but there's also, and here's like the Catholic notion of pouring yourself out,
Yes, the kenosis kind of
the
thing.
kenosis aspect of pouring out. And I think that happens through the speech act in psychoanalysis in a way, not that you find God in there or anything like that, but that the unconscious comes out in this instance. It's an encounter. It's the encounter of the other, since the other is the unconscious is the discourse of the other, and the other that's ultimately barred because it can't be signified, right? And ultimately, it has a hole in it. There is no other for the other. That's what Lacan will say. And so I think on the other end, there is, in a way, and this is why Lacan and Mark, Gerard Murphy's big on the homology of Lacan with St. John of the Cross, that this encounter is, in a sense, a subjective destitution from oneself. And that's where the encounter with Christ is. It ultimately has to do with, again, the direction of desire. And I think it's the direction of your attention and of desire as well. And I think that is something, again, like what we were, this juxtaposition of Buddhism and the mystical and the mystical in Christianity. Desire has, at least in the medieval and then even ancient mystical tradition, desire plays a role. In a sort of positive way, to desire God and your will. Whereas like now, when you get into the technicality of it, desire is not like bad, but desire is a sort of wheel of all the different cause and conditions for Buddhism, and the fetters of the mind, of lust. The main poisons are, what is it? Attachment, aversion, and ignorance, I believe. Yeah. And those create a sort of effect, which then creates a chain, and that chain would be desire. But it's quite subtle. Some people just kind of take that, then desire is bad. No, because then, like, if you desire enlightenment, then that is desire as well. So like, and you won't get rid of desire, but like you won't get caught in like the what they would call dependent origination, because that's what karma comes from, is dependent origination. But yeah, I think like that's a really like a good point to make, is there is a distinction between the mystical in Christianity and Buddhism, and it's the role of desire. And I think that desire kind of gets sort of forgotten about in the way that contemporary Christianity talks about it, and just like the mystical. And I think that is another way for me personally, where, like, again, I should stress that I am a practicing Catholic. I have an interest in theology, interest in the sort of mystical and the more highly theoretical, philosophical, theological stuff, but I'm in no way a specialist. So, you know, I'm not as rigorous as I would be intellectually talking about it as I would with like psychoanalysis, which is my main specialization, and in like Marxism. But yeah, like on a down to earth personal level, it's like I could see how the way that desire is kind of like poured out and directed like my attention when I pray, and kind of even ask myself like, what is it that I'm trying to pray for? You know, what am I trying to talk to? And like in forgetting myself, the encounter with the other that's Christ. And it's like not like Christ is going to like tear the sky apart and then he's gonna like come down, but that it happened as an encounter with somebody else, like seeing the other, or seeing Christ as the other in a random person, whether it's like a homeless person or you know, somebody at the grocery store, or just like anybody. You know, it is an encounter.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I really loved like Thomas Merton. Like I haven't been into like a lot of
yeah, no, he's good. Yeah.
Like he met Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama like talks him up. He's also met Suzuki. Thomas Merton's like the man for me.
The Zen Buddhist, right?
Yeah,
he's good.
Like Thomas Merton's like the man, because I'm like this guy, he's a Catholic. And he wanted so bad to, I forgot, there's like this old interview talking about like Thomas Merton came to, I think like some guy that's like some Hindu yogi. And he was like, hey, I'm really into this like Eastern religious stuff. And he's like, look, I think you should just read like St. Augustine, Eckhart. Like he like totally directed him to like mystical theology, because he's like, it's all right there. But yeah, I mean, even towards like the end of his life, like I mean, this guy's writing about Daoism, Buddhism, and he's all into it, even like Sufism.
I don't know much, like a lot about Sufism, but what I've read and heard, it's so beautiful. It's absolutely amazing.
Rumi is like, I love Rumi. He's the shit. I think Ibn Arabi is definitely a Neoplatonist for sure. He's definitely like the Platonic version of the Islamic world. I mean, he's insane. But it's all like, yeah, it's super fascinating stuff. I mean, this kind of mystical theology, mysticism, contemplation, like all this stuff for me kind of like saved religion for me.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Because I would say, like, if that stuff didn't exist, I would be like, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And I was just gonna say, like, you know, and I think me being immersed in the psychoanalysis, like one of the things when you have like not only like as like undergoing the practice of it, but also like the more I'm like immersed in the theory and like Lacan's teaching, because one of the things that kind of separates Lacan from Freud, even though he's returning to Freud, is questions on teaching. Teaching analysts what the hell we're doing, you know, something that we can't see, but you know, you can't say it either exists or doesn't exist, but it's the unconscious. It somehow insists, and the you know, ultimately what it is this you know, our symptom, which is a sexual symptom, which is the, you know, or that there is no sexual relation, right? This is the core of you know, for lack of a better term, the realization of the truth of the speaking being in psychoanalysis. But the point is, like, he makes these apophatic statements. It's like, yeah, like, you know, there is no sexual relation, but we can make statements of the impossibility, you know, of sexuality. We can make these statements that can account for the contradiction or the impossibility to say things. In the same way, we can make statements about God, even though ultimately God is none of these things. But, you know, in a sense, we could account for that. And I think that that's a logic. It's, you know, it's definitely logic that the you know, the mystics and ancient theologians and medieval were very much like keened on, that I think has been forgotten in our discussion, because I think there's so much like positivistic notion of God, or just like needing to experience it. Well, I can't see him, so therefore it doesn't exist. There's not enough evidence. But like the way that contemplation does have an overall effect on one's worldview, one's Weltanschauung, is one's entire subjectivity. But on the level of being able to teach, and again, you mentioned Augustine. What I like about Augustine, because like I definitely think he was like in the mystical tradition, but he wasn't like in the way that you would see like an Eckhart bro, or like you know, like or like again pseudo Dionysus or Origen. But what I like about him, and I know like this is cool, like the homology between Lacan and Augustine, because Lacan loves to talk about Augustine a lot, is Augustine was that was a funny slip. Augustine, I was gonna say, Augustine was in a sense doing a sort of proto linguistics, Saussurian linguistics before Saussure. Also funny, he invented the cogito and then didn't need that after all, because that wasn't what he was going to base his epistemology on to find God in the city of God, with the doubt and certainty. But he wants to focus on signs and what signs can show us and reveal to us about God, and how to teach these signs. And he's like, showing in different parts of the scripture what these signs that God gives us are. But my point is that like he is able to show us with language and with teaching and learning that we could come to God that way. And in a sense, it is, mystical in the sense that we don't need to search the stars or, close our eyes and shut ourselves from the world and just like meditate until God comes out. It's like in the way that we learn and from the speech is that we come to the encounter, and it basically starts first the question, but the way that we orient ourselves using language and science that ultimately teach and reveal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about Augustine, but lately this has been a theme now coming up because somebody else brought it up in the Kristeva group again, about Augustine and Lacan. And I was like, dang, I really got to read Augustine. I have his Confessions in my library for sure. But City of God seems to be I guess that's like the OG, like.
Honestly, that is, and I would say that was actually the first one I read from Augustine. I honestly, sadly, like, even though I'm a big fan of Augustine, have honestly the least times I spent the least time on Confessions, even though it's supposed to, like, everybody like loves to read that, even like literature scholars. I think it definitely is important. But I think like a lot of like the huge chunk of like his heavy theoretical stuff is like in City of God, but the Trinity, which is his defense of the Trinity, and his main like thinkers that he's attacking are like people with like all these different heresies during his time, like defending against modalism, like thinking that God or like is just like one person, and the Trinity just represents three different masks that he wears. And so Jesus is just one aspect, the Holy Spirit is one aspect, and then like the Father is another one, but like God is ultimately one. That's flawed, because it's like, no, because Jesus wouldn't need to pray to himself, and you always see those like atheist meme jokes like, hey God, it's me, you that's exactly. But that there is that this the famous Trinity diagram of like God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Like Father is not the Son, Son is not the Father. That whole thing comes from the Council of Nicaea, with the first I think it's the first one where it came on the interpretation of the Trinity. But he's tapped into that, and he's going into dialogue with everybody and showing line by line from not only like certain parts of the Old Testament, but also like talking about St. Paul and his letters, to like what Jesus says in certain passages of that when Jesus speaks, there's speaking as the Son of Man, and then he's also speaking as the Son of God in certain ways. So that's pretty much like rough synopsis of that text, which I highly recommend. But I think the one on language, so there's two. There's one that's on teaching, but the one that I like that I like to reference a lot, and Lacan actually in the first seminar towards the end does a big investigation of it. It's what's it called? I think it's called On Teaching, but it's a dialogue between it's called De Magistro, on the teacher. It's a dialogue between him and his son Adiamantis on the function of language. and to ultimately find God. Yeah, that's probably like my favorite Augustine. It's really short too, and it's written like a Platonic dialogue.
It's funny that you talk about language, because I've been like more and more convinced about like silence. Because lately, like, Buddhism and even like some of the contemplation, because even like Thomas Merton talks about like silence being like this abiding in like God's presence. But then like that doesn't make any sense until you do some, like do some practices and reading. Like I've been experimenting with, for the first time actually, experimenting with Lectio Divina. And that is I'm actually liking it, because in some sense you can almost free associate a little bit, because you select a passage, like a small passage. And the thing that you're supposed to do is you're supposed to like select a small piece, so a word or a couple of lines that stand out to you. And then you're supposed to like, reflect, pray, rest, like they call it, like rest in God, kind of thing. And then you just go back to reading the small passage again. But I really like this because it's supposed to be like a dialogue between you and God. It's not supposed to be like you're supposed to dissect what the text means, or give like an exegesis on the whole thing, right? It's supposed to be like a communing with God. And for me, that's really changed. That's actually really been really helpful, because there seems to be a kind of speaking back and forth, even like in, I think like Psalms and Proverbs are definitely my favorite.
Oh yeah, I love the Psalms so much.
Yeah, Psalms hits the nail for me, because there's like early Psalms, like I think it's like 4, where he says something like, God, like basically God already answers, like he always hears what you're asking.
Yeah.
And so it's funny, because you grow up with this kind of Christianity, or at least I grew up with this kind of Christianity of like, we're like, not to demean people or anything, but like basically you get the impression of like, okay, I'm gonna ask God for stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I want good grades, God. Like I want to pass this test. But then as I'm like reorienting myself now, it's like when you're reading the Psalms carefully, it's like, no, man, that's like literally it's God is all you need. Right? And what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Is something to discover and encounter, but like that is essentially it. Like God is that over kind of abundant presence, that you just empty yourself into. And so it's super interesting that it's completely reoriented my understanding of prayer. Instead of like asking for stuff, it's more like abiding. How do I abide? And how do I empty to abide in this presence?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Catholicism, it's funny because I people talk about orthodoxy a lot, and I've always been split, because it's funny because like Seventh-day Adventists have a really bad taste for Catholicism, like the Pope and all this, even though I really like Pope Francis.
Oh yeah, same, yeah. And you'll see like not only the Seventh Day, but like the Protestants, the evangelicals, they all like don't like the Catholics. Orthodox.
And that's what's always made me sympathetic to the Catholics, ironically.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, well, I feel like the Catholics got something going on. But then there's the ortho bros.
Yeah. Ortho bros. Yeah.
But I mean, just in general, I guess I'm like, sometimes I think very pragmatic. So I'll be curious about your idea on this. Is that, I mean, Catholicism is just kind of just more popular in America than
Then
than orthodoxy. So it doesn't actually make sense to me, even if I were to be like, oh, I think orthodoxy is more correct than Catholicism, which I've never really cared too much about that debate.
which is
Personally,
like honestly a minor debate. It's like a minor. It's not a minor debate. It's a big debate that separates us, but it's like a minor issue, really. At least from
right.
what I understand. And like, I know you had I think Hunter on. So I know he's big on like reading the Catholic and the I think he's ultimately an Orthodox.
Yeah.
But you know, he reads the Catholic literature. But and again, he's not only practicing Christian, but that's his specialty. But I think, like, just to put it simply and bluntly, I think what separates the Orthodox and the Catholics is just the filioque, that the Catholics believe that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah.
Oh
Whereas,
my God,
they don't. And I don't know if this is true, but this is what I think I've heard most Orthodox say, is that they even, and some will actually kind of give a lower status to Christ compared to the Father. And I think it's because of that. Whereas the Catholics say no, that the Son is equal to the Father. They share the Holy Spirit. That's their love. Yeah.
Mm.
So that's literally like what it is. And yeah, like you know, at least like if everything isn't like, you know, the non-denominational universal church or whatever, it, you know, we have some Catholics, but yeah, like Orthodoxy is not that big. I have seen some like Greek Orthodox churches, but like rarely have I seen like any like Russian Orthodox or anything like that. I think, or like even like Ethiopian Orthodox, like I've seen like a couple, but like yeah, it's more, I guess, popular, like in I guess it's a geographical historical thing. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because it's like it's still very ethnocentric.
Yeah.
Like I think I ended up like, because I wanted to check one out. I ended up,
I'm highly interested in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, or like the
that does
African
sound interesting to me.
Orthodoxy stuff. It's yeah, I love their icons. Their artwork is just so beautiful.
Yeah.
And you know, like it's probably bridging to like the Eastern stuff a bit, but like one of the aesthetic things that I really liked is Japanese Catholicism, because it has like this sort of like a lot
Interesting.
of their parishes. Like I love the way that their icon statues of Mary and Christ are, because it kind of looks like a little bit like Guanyin or like Kannon, and the which is a bodhisattva in Buddhism, but they kind of look like those like really nice like Zen shrine, like, or Zen meditation spaces, but then they have the altar right there, so it's like very simplistic, but it's like this sort of feudal Japan aesthetic that makes it so appealing and just beautiful. And I just like grew up like in Asian culture, and I know you like anime as well. I'm a big anime nerd, so like, you know, I love just anything Asian culture and just the aesthetic. And yeah, it's just so beautiful, and like it has that sort of Zen Buddhist like aesthetic to it, but they're Catholics, and there's also just a simplicity to it compared to like the big extravagant monasteries or bastilles or parishes that you see in Orthodox. Also, what's interesting that I've noticed about Orthodox in the way that they perform liturgy compared to Catholics, although I think some Byzantine Catholics do, I could be wrong, but the way that the altar is set up, whenever they are doing the liturgy of the Eucharist, they're behind a curtain, or they're behind a door that's got just the pictures of the icons and the saints, and I think it's actually the apostles. This is in the Orthodoxy. I think that's really interesting. So like you don't see them performing the transubstantiation and all that like you would at a Catholic mass.
Right. No, I actually, yes, I saw this actually, because I I ended up slipping into a Greek Orthodox church while they were doing something like that.
Oh, I would love to go.
And I was like, oh, they're actually like hiding behind this altar doing the, I mean, I loved it, but also I was just like, okay. I mean, just like aesthetically, I've always appreciated the Catholic and the Orthodox. I've always struggled with kind of everything else. Like, you know, some like Protestant stuff and everything, but I understand people like the music in Protestant style. But for me, it's always been like, I don't know, maybe I've just been naturally more inclined to it, just like the silence
Yeah.
and the like chanting and just the art. The
Mhm.
art, man, like that totally pulls me in.
Yeah, it's so
Um,
beautiful.
you did say something about, and I am interested in this because it's hard to navigate this because in some ways, like being Catholic, um, you're saying like the political differences, and so you like kind of refrain from attending a lot, or
Yeah,
trying to keep like
it's
a
it's more of
distance,
like,
like you said,
oh,
like a
I'm
distance.
a Marxist, so therefore I don't need to be at the church. It's more of I just get tired of hearing like all the like, oh, the country is just going to hell because nobody wants to be a Catholic anymore, and the Democratic Party, and just like, and I'm not a Democrat, but like it's just like how they're like they're just destroying Western values and bringing communism over, and I'm just like, bro, shut up. And yeah, and like it just got really old,
Mm-hmm.
and I think also because I think the one part about like my experience with like going through and being baptized at that specific Catholic church was that I was so immersed because like um like I didn't really have I was in Virginia, so like I wasn't like in California where I'm at now, so like all my friends and family were over there. So like I was like trying to make like new friends and family over there, and I think like in that process realized like like these like some of these people were just like mad ignorant. I just needed to like separate myself from that. So I think that was the main thing. And just like, yeah, like the way they treat women there, it was just like, I didn't like it at all. And then like the stuff that Catholics are always going on about like, or just any church was just like the evils of abortion and all that stuff, and just missing the point. So that was like another thing too. But like it's not that like surprisingly like you know with Marxism though, because there's the famous criticism of religion that Marx has. It's actually not one of a cosmological debate of the existence or inexistence of God. Rather, it's more of the critique of religion on the religiosity of the state, and the way that sort
Mm.
of philosophers have put these sort of quasi mystifications of the state, and religion being the opium of the masses is like a sort of thing where he says it's like the way in that it can reveal our suffering, but like in a sort of misrecognized form. Religion has
Right.
always done that. And the point is to like be able to break off our chains, instead of picking imaginary flowers, we pick real flowers. And I think it has to do with just the way that in which like, an ideology, which we're all around ideology. Marxism is ideology. It's the difference of like the dominant versus the non-dominant one, but it's just the one that can't recognize the truth. But there is a lot of work on Marxism religion, and also even liberation theology, which it actually originated in Latin America.
Right.
The father of it passed
Mhm.
away recently.
Yeah, I saw that.
Gutierrez. Yeah, and so getting into him kind of really helped reconcile. I could still do this and be a Catholic, or still be a Catholic and still have radical politics, and I still hold this way. And like there is like a criticism of the sort of messianic socialist or communist that existed during Marx's time. But I think like, with the beauty of Marx's and Marxism's contribution, that like you could think a radical politics. I do see like on Facebook, I follow like a group that's like, I don't know if they actually organize or if they're just an online group, but it's called like Radical Ministry. And they're Marxists that are Christians. I don't know. I think they just probably accept all denominations of Christianity. I don't know what
Mhm.
their specific origin is as far as like religion goes, but yeah, it's just to kind of simplify it. Like what your point was, it's like that's really what it was. It was more of just like just don't want to associate with y'all because you're just mad ignorant, and like I'm just like I can't really even relate to, like, I want to, relate to you on a personal level, but like when you're just constantly every other sentence is mouthing off of just like, oh, just like kids these days and just the liberal media, and like I'm like I'm sorry. There's only so much we can talk about if you keep bringing up the liberal media and all that.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been like my biggest fear of just like, I don't know how I would. I mean, like, I know I could just not act like I know anything, whatever, like, not say anything of what I know, because I know if I said things, like, it would be disturbing for some people. It's really funny that you bring up like Marxism, because like I was like Thomas Merton, like I think like Dorothy Day is like being put up possibly for sainthood or whatever. She started off Marxist, and then she like was like, oh, it's like in Christianity, like the whole principle is. But like Thomas Merton, I think I liked his take on it, because he's like, Marx, he's really saying something, and he's basically saying that, well, the way Thomas Merton read this was, I thought, brilliant, because he was like, so it took Marx to tell us that Christianity failed.
Mhm.
We have the principles there, but we just failed to like capitalize on it. We just were just like, oh, blessed are the poor.
Yeah.
And it's like, and this is what like Dorothy Day kind of concluded too. She's like, okay, yeah, like blessed are the poor, but like that doesn't mean that we shouldn't not change the system.
Yeah.
And Merton's on like the same train too, where he's like, I mean, this whole idea of the focus on the poor, and then like also the poor as like a metaphor for your destitution towards God, and all this other stuff. So it's like, it's interesting that there's certain forms of theology, and it's funny because most people wouldn't even think like, oh, this is actually a kind of theological philosophy that kind of gave its interpretive ideology on how we perceive what we should do with the poor, and then what we should do with the system. But there's a lot, there's definitely a lot that goes on there. Protestantism, this idea of like the Protestant work ethic, not to blame Protestants, but like I think it started off as like a good thing, but then like, oh, like now it's kind of leaked into not just a Protestant work ethic, but like everybody wants to like grind, get money. Like it's just like it's a very interesting development of that line of thought that kind of like, I don't think they really anticipated the consequences of that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people like Weber was the one that was like coined the Protestant, the Protestant work ethic, in his essay on like Protestantism and capitalism, and then like Jameson talks about it like as a vanishing mediator of like, and Zizek does too. Like it's like the Protestant work ethic like was paved because of capitalism, like the rise of that, and like the transition into more like the bourgeois class and industrial society. But like, yeah, I think what's interesting in what you were saying was that one, like both Merton and what was the other person?
Dorothy Day,
like they both saw like some sort of merit in Marxism, and it's interesting how like she went from Marxist to Catholic.
I found that interesting too.
Yeah, and I mean that's not like something that's like new to me. Like I know, like for instance, this I think he's Polish. He's a Polish Marxist, but then like I think like after like the failures of Marxism in the USSR, he wrote this work called The Currents of Marxism. Kolakowski, I forget his first name. But he went from being a Marxist to kind of being some sort of like moderate socialist that was kind of like very much like ambivalent in Marxism, but he wrote like a long like sort of critique and like a sort of genealogical analysis of the dialectic that originates from Plotinus all the way down to Marx, and then became Catholic. And then you have on the other end like someone else that I forget the first name, but he was a colleague of the American historian Christopher Lasch. Christopher Lasch wrote the text Culture of Narcissism. He's an American historian and Trotskyist, and remained a Marxist until his death. But his colleague Genovese went from being a Trotskyist to a Catholic and became radically conservative. So like this, from Marxism to Catholicism, and kind of see that trend, and it sometimes ends very poorly. And I think like really like, yeah, I mean, like, sure, like Marx does, show something like that's similar to Christianity. I think so. I buy it. But, I think like really, and it goes back to what I kind of said, like inverting the Dalai Lama's thing. I don't think that like people should just be Christians then, because Marx, told us like something that, Christianity failed to do. And, now we're realizing it, because that would take away people's religious freedom and all that. And I think, I'm not like one where it's like, even though I am a Christian and I believe in Jesus Christ, that I'm going to be like, your way of practicing religion is false and you're going to go to hell. Like, I don't know. I can't buy that.
Right.
But I think that Marxism can help Christians be a better Christian by taking that into account. That's like not Buddhism making you a better Christian, Marxism making you a bebetter Christian, or even Marxism making you a better Islamist, or like a better Jewish or Buddhist or whatever. Just because you take into account like the way that you operate in the movement and unfoldment of history, and the way that society transforms and sublates, taking that dialectic into account. Religion, is put it simply, just like it's concerned with the worldview. It is concerned with the fate of mankind and questions concerning the divine, but it's not politics. Theology is not politics.
Right.
And that's where I'm Badiouing in. Surprisingly, Badiou doesn't have a truth event for religion, even though he's very obsessed with St. Paul.
Right. Yeah, I have noticed that too.
Yeah, he doesn't have a truth event for religion, but politics is a truth event. It is a truth that has its own procedures, and we should respect that.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I was like working through being an event, and it's interesting that Badiou, even though he's very adamant about, he's like, I have like one critique of him, but like I don't even think it's so much a critique versus like he kind of acknowledges that a way of approaching philosophy is kind of like, it's basically like his philosophy, the way he pursues it and talks about it, is also his meta version of doing his philosophy. Like him talking about being an event is also his fidelity to this truth. Procedure, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, like Badiou kind of like escapes criticism a little bit, but like not entirely, but like he's doing his philosophy. Like when he's talking about it, he's saying he has a fidelity to this idea of mathematics, his ontology, and so on. So he's literally working this out in front of us as he's still alive, as he's still going through. He's working this out. So that's what I admire about him, is that has the fidelity enough to just continue working it out because he believes there's something there. And in that sense, I feel like Badiou is actually like, religious.
Yeah, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, because like that's what I started noticing about Badiou, where it's like his ultimate ground, in some sense, it's not the ultimate ground, but it's definitely dependent upon it, which is that fidelity. Without that fidelity, you can't work out the truth procedure.
Yeah, because it's like you have to realize that, based upon the situation, because ontology is a situation where the presentation of multiplicity comes in. And so it's like, what we could, I'm just saying this slightly, I don't know if I'm conflating terms or not, you know, when it comes to Badu, but just say, like, just put it simply in like layman's terms. It's like, based on what choice that you make, you're then given a set of different possibilities that you're just gonna be like, fuck it, we ball. Like, I have to, you know, honestly just, you know, from here, see what I could work with and then create a different truth or a different procedure from set choices and elements that I have. And I mean, it's literally, it's mathematics. It's like you pretty much are able to deduce or, you know, imply or investigate from what is already given in that instance or in that moment. And then as we keep going through this procedure, something unfolds, something ruptures and appears, and that, you know, is the truth. It's like you wouldn't know that without, the fidelity. And so it's like there is a sort of like, you know, trust or faith that you have to put in the procedure or in the logic. You know, that's the kind of the funny part about it.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that's what the thing is about, like, talking about God. It's like not enough to disprove God in propositions or prove God in propositions. You kind of just have to, like, just go. Like, you either do it or don't do it, you know.
Yeah.
But
Shake
if
and
you
bake.
do it, like, obviously people have discovered things and have encountered unfoldings that have been like, oh yeah, this is something to keep doing. This is something to keep adamantly going on. So it's really interesting. I mean, it's funny because, like, yeah, like reading Badu is like, I was like, oh, that's really interesting because, like, he's kind of showing me like a weird way of like how faith is necessary and needs to work that way. Like, you can't get the outcome that you want unless you have a fidelity to pursuing this thing in the first place.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting with Badu. But to kind of go back, I mean, I do agree on the Marxist makes us better Christians, for sure, because I think, like, because Christianity is so contingent upon its historical framing, that it would kind of need something like like, for example, we would have never gotten something like liberation theology without Marxism. Right? So like, to me, I'm like, obviously that's already kind of like a little bit of the proof right there of like, if theology doesn't make itself historical and respond to what is actually happening, which is kind of like Marx's call anyways, like you need to respond to what is happening, then, you know, the theology is always going to be kind of lagging and kind of falling behind. So yeah, I mean, and I think people think that, I think the other thing is people generally think that theology is like the, I don't know, like, I guess they think it should never change.
Right.
They think it's like they equivocate theology with their experience of God, when in reality your experience of God is completely untarnished by that theology. You know, there's theology and then there's your experience. They don't have to be necessarily equivocal, but it does help to have a theology, right? To just be able to speak and say something, but fundamentally it's always going to be negated, and that's the experience of the encounter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I think, like, and especially Catholics, it's like just our I mean, which is good, but like it also is a problem too, like, you know, outside of the liberation theology, but like just, you know, more scholastic theology, is that it's rooted in scripture. So like we only need to look in there. So we only need to look in there, which, you know, like I follow, like, fair enough, you know, fair enough. But history still moves and changes, and you know, if there is a divine, then the divine is going to intervene. So it's like, you know, maybe the fact that, you know, God intervenes and we can prove that in the Bible, yeah, sure, but unfortunately the Bible doesn't talk about, you know, what's happening right now. And so, you know, we need to adapt our theology to fit into, you know, what's going on in the material contradictions and social antagonisms and class struggle, for lack of a better term. And so that's why, yeah, I know Marxism would make theology more well-rounded for faith-based practitioners. That and again, like a good example would be like someone like John Milbank, who is I think he's Anglican, but he's a Marxist. He has that famous debate, which sadly doesn't get talked about enough, but it's in a text. It's a debate with Zizek. It's called The Monstrosity of Christ.
I love that. I like that book.
Yeah. So he's another radical Christian. Who funny enough, my mentor Mark actually knows him quite well, so it's actually pretty cool.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I talked to Hunter about this. Like, Milbank got me really interested in what was at stake between Hegelian dialectics and paradox.
Right.
The monstrosity of Christ. That like Milbank really gave a forceful kind of like, I'm like, oh shit, okay, because like, I mean, in some sense, I mean, like, I think I was talking to Daniel Garner about this, but like Daniel Garner's like, well, you know, there's some sense like we could look at them like maybe they're the same in a sense. But I think what me and Hunter kind of came across was like dialectics. I'm okay with the logic, but when it comes to like picking something historical, I feel like it's pretty ambiguous. Because like Zizek, what I noticed what Zizek does, he goes, okay, so the historical change of Christianity was Martin Luther.
Right.
And he goes, and this is a part of the dialectical unfolding. And I'm just like, well, I mean, maybe like I feel like that's the debatable point of contention, right? Because Catholic history still continues. With a disagreement about but for Christian atheism to work, you have to accept the Protestant presupposition
right of the dialectic. And so like it becomes a sort of like conflation of emergence, you know. It's just like where do we locate the emergence for the dialectic? And I wouldn't agree with that. I think I mean, like, you know, the dialectic or paradox is interesting. Then, you know, another thing is this is a big thing, and it's funny, I was talking about it yesterday with Raul, the I don't know if you follow him. I forget his last name, but he's the Australian cat who has that podcast where he's invited, I think, Hunter and Cadell, but he talks a lot about like philosophy of science and stuff like that. But I was mentioning this to him because it's one thing that, you know, again, and when we talk about theology, or if we talk about Christianity, in the realm of philosophy, well, Christianity is metaphysics, first of all. And one of the metaphysical concepts that's kind of been jettisoned since like the birth of modern philosophy is what's called Analogia Entis.
Mark Murphy talks about this.
Analogia Entis. And you could find it kind of reemerge from this thinker. I think he is Polish. He's a philosopher and theologian, but trained in Germany. So he was well read in like Husserl, Heidegger, and a lot of the phenomenology, and then in continental. But his name is Eric Prisvara, and he wants to resuscitate this important term of the Analogia Entis, which is unity and difference, and the way that it participates. And so in a sense, it is like dialectics. Now, Mark's point, and I don't know if Eric Prisvara says this, but Mark's point, and I think maybe it just depends on, again, what do we mean by dialectics and how did Hegel conceive it? It would mean like we have to have a close reading of it. But he thinks that, well, he agrees with the dialectic, Mark does, that he thinks that Hegel collapses the Trinity into spirit or into Geist. And so therefore we lose the Analogia Entis, which is founded on the way that it operates in the Trinity, and then the way that the Trinity unfolds and operates onto God's creation, and the way that the difference allows for participation and this interplay of
Right.
man that is different from God, but also created by God, and the way that we operate with the Holy Spirit in Christ. So there is it's an interesting relational metaphysics, but it's not to say that, hey, we're all connected. And so we all, no, there's definitely the way that there are different determinations, but this is a key thing. And it's talked about in Aquinas quite a lot. But I guess it just like, it depends on like one, if, for me, I guess it becomes conflictual because like, I like when I think of philosophy and metaphysics and I think of Kant as like, Kant is the start of philosophy because he created critical philosophy. And so the Kantian Copernican shift also changes the way that we do metaphysics. And so to avoid dogma or dogmatic statements, we have to understand how they operate within the function of understanding in these categories. Same thing with Hegel. So I think that would be my only thing. It's like, are we just negating the Kantian revolution to go back to sort of pre-critical metaphysics, or are we going to use that in line with what Kant's contribution was?
That is the interesting thing, because I know that, I know you've read a lot of thinkers on like Kant, like they talk about Kant, and I forgot what.
Yeah, and my reading of Kant is quite different from like mainstream Kant scholarship. The two thinkers are like Kojin Karatani, the Japanese.
Right, you've been reading that person, right? Yeah.
Yeah, who's the Japanese Marxist. He's an overall Renaissance man. He's a historian. He's a philosopher. He's an economist. He's a political thinker. But he wrote a bunch of essays that compiled in one text called Transcritique on Kant and Marx. And he has a homologous reading of Marx and Kant. And he also rethinks Kant in light of all the criticisms. And even the way that he reads the noumena is actually, in a sense, it's not this thing that's like outside of us. It's actually, the reason itself is limit. But that when you read the first critique, when he says it's like, well, knowledge isn't reducible to experience. It does first start with experience. And and what pretty much causes the force for understanding on us is the thing in itself, right? And so he shows that the thing in itself is actually more active, and that it puts a sort of causal force onto the subject. So the noumena is not passive, and the subject active, like a sort of crude interpretation of Kant. No, rather that the noumena is the active force and the subject is passive. And in a way, it's kind of similar to the sort of like objet impinges onto the subject and propels the subject to move in psychoanalysis. And then he's like goes down to like a line of critiquing all these like criticisms of Kant, like Popper and so on. And then he'll show like an interesting like historical play of like similar themes in Kant with Marx, but they both have a Copernican shift, and that's what makes them kind of similar. And that like Kant paved the way for Marxism. Same thing with Lucien Goldman, who's a French Marxist who wrote a whole work on Immanuel Kant as a proto-socialist and not like a traditional liberal thinker. But yeah, like what Karatani says is like the way that Hume woke Kant up from his dogmatic slumber, because before he read Hume, he was a Leibnizian, but like from this guy named Wolff and then someone else, is very similar to Marx. He was woken up from his dogmatic slumber because he was aligned with Ricardo Smith's theory of labor value, and it was sort of like a sort of ontological category in the way that it was used, like it was taken as like a sort of fact or a given. And then he reads this guy named Bailey, who's a English economist, and socially necessary labor thus put him into question in the way that Kant's dogmatic slumber from the statement of, well, wait, no, not every event has a cause, or we can't prove that in Hume. So that shifted the gears. And so like I just thought that was just a really creative spin that Karatani does. He was also trained under Derrida. So he was a literary critic before he came into like Kant and Marxism and stuff like that.
That's interesting. It's really fascinating the way that you're saying that Karatani describes the noumena, because it's actually like I mean, it's crazy because it's actually reminding me of the way Martin Buber describes, because he's actually takes his response to Kant might actually be Karatani's understanding,
right?
Because he's like, no, it's not like this necessarily like this completely barred thing. It's like it reaches out to you. It encounters you.
So here's the spin. And now that you brought up Buber, because Buber is talking about the I and the Tao, right?
Right.
So I'm not comparing that with Kant with Buber, but like what it reminded me of is like what I was trying to get at. The point of Karatani's reading of Kant is that, so yeah, the noumena isn't just something out there that we can't know, but rather it's the bar of reason itself, like the limits of reason that is noumenal. But then the way he reads it, he's like, what inspires the third critique, the critique of judgment, right, is that the noumena really the whole time is the question of the other. And what does the other want, and what does the other mean to me? Because it is inspired by an essay that he wrote called Dreams of a Visionary. He was really like good friends and with Emanuel Swedenborg, the scientist, and he used to have a lot of visions, and he was like kind of like an esoteric thinker. And Kant, being super rational, even though he was a Protestant and believed in God, like didn't believe in all the woo like hypnotism, seeing visions and spirits. And Kant prior to that would say that, well, you're psychotic, you are not rational, you're not reasonable, you're talking about things that cannot be seen or proven. But the question for him was like, well, Emanuel Swedenborg is someone that I know who has a lot of philosophical rigor. He's a scientist. He's very rational. He, can intellectually like make well-structured arguments, but yet then he's like also seeing ghosts and having visions of God and all these things, doing these things with magnetism. So that put into question what he can know about the other. And so then, not only with the critique of, the beauty and the sublime, with, his critique of judgment, but that Emanuel Swedenborg essay kind of shifts the way that the noumena is not about like, what I can know as far as just like knowledge, but it's like, it's an ethical thing about like, what is the other to me? So that is the radicality of Kant, but a la Karatani is what he's saying, that the noumena is the question of the other.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's bonkers. It's bonkers.
Yeah, the question of the other. I mean, that makes sense because like even Buber, without even having like, because he thinks his response he thinks he's like giving a critique of Kant in that sense by saying that there's this encounter, you can have this always encounter versus like this kind of barredness, right? The presence is always there. You just have to it's definitely an argument of attention too. Like you have to like direct yourself toward it, surrender yourself and so on. But Buber isn't also the problem with talking about Martin Buber is that he's not systematic at all.
Right.
So it's almost like we really wouldn't have gone like we would need Karatani anyways, because Buber would not really have explained anything. And he was just kind of, even like his friend Rosenzweig was kind of critical of the way he would write, because he's like, you could write more clear, but Buber was always kind of like poetical.
Yeah, he's like more poetical. He's not like a theoretician, or he's not
right.
Like,
and he's also a Nietzsche boy, so he's he really loves Nietzsche, so he's not really interested too much in giving like a system or anything. There's this like one line, he's just like, I just want to point to something. So in that sense, like I think for me, Buber is actually great for me coming like to a reconceptualizing of God, because it really emphasizes like what you were talking about earlier, which is like, oh, well, you know, if I do these practices, like it leaves me open to like encounter God in other people. And like that was basically like Buber's whole thing. Like, how do we encounter the thou in other people? And not just people, but like everything we encounter, like everything we see, art, animals, you know, nature, just like how do we encounter this? And like for Buber, it was a complete, you know, basically, I mean, he was Jewish, so he didn't really give like a systematic account, but basically we call this like grace, you know, kind of like it, we can't really do this on our own. There's always this question of mutual reciprocation that I felt like he was kind of a little bit like Master Eckhart was like, the eye that I see God with is also the same eye that God sees me. I think he was definitely shooting for that kind of reciprocality with the I and thou encounter. But some people kind of critiqued him on like whether it could actually be a mutual reciprocation when you encounter God in the other. And that was something that I've always been thinking about. But okay, so I don't know if you have anything else to say on that, because I'm about to switch it to the body and God.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, okay.
Yeah. I don't have much to say anything else, but yeah.
Okay.
Let's get into that.
Okay. So yeah, so I've been seeing you on Instagram. I mean, I absolutely love it when you post all the like Taoist kind of like movements. It's like super peaceful. I know you've been doing a lot of practices. You always do videos too. But you constantly show stories about like people just kind of like doing a variety of movements, slow movements, practices. And I'm just like definitely coming from the Buddhist perspective of like, this is very like mindfulness.
Yeah.
Like all these training like help recenter you in the body. So again, I'm not, you know, I know you're not like a theologian. I know you're not like anything or an expert on like that kind of stuff, but I am curious about your opinion on what have you discovered by doing this stuff, the body and God, or how are you connecting it? Or
No, I have never actually, I guess maybe like explicitly connected that, but like, yeah, you know, like I'll just kind of elaborate and like go into detail. Yeah, like what I do and like what I've posted, because like, you know, for me, fitness has been a big part of my life, like even before getting into philosophy and spirituality and psychoanalysis and Marxism, but martial arts and fitness, weightlifting, big part of my life. And when I was doing Chinese martial arts growing up, it was prior to wrestling all throughout high school. I was doing it was a mix of Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do, which we call JKD for short, but Jeet Kune Do is the martial art that Bruce Lee created, which was just meant to be a style of no style, but it's kind of like fixed into certain styles now. So it's like his version of MMA, but like with different systems of like Wing Chun, karate, some American kickboxing, and some stuff from judo and wrestling, more combative. So it's more street oriented. It's not a sport. And my instructor, he rooted it in what's called internal martial arts, which has a Taoist element to it. But internal martial arts or internal medicine, it's a big category because you could also tie in what's called Qigong, which means it's like energy work. But internal martial arts is Tai Chi, Bagua, and Xingyi. So Tai Chi, you have Tai Chi, which is just like the ultimate principle, like in Daoism. It's the one that becomes yin and yang. But then Tai Chi Chuan means the way of the fist or the principle of the fist. And you think like, well, what does that have to do with martial arts? Because people are just going like this, they're breathing, they're doing all these movements, but they're actually like forms that they do have a mindful bodily effect where you feel mindful, you feel present in the moment, but it's a martial art because you're doing them in so slow, choreographed, sequential movements that allow you to center your body, to feel in a certain way, to open up different parts of the body that you don't get by weightlifting. So like, for instance, spinal alignment with the neck and opening up the hips. So there is just like that basic anatomy aspect to it. But, like it's a part of like, it's emerged with like the, reemergence of Chinese medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. And you have like herbalism, acupuncture, and these breathing exercises, which are called Qigong, but they originate, and so does Tai Chi and Bagua, which is another martial art, and Xingyi, which is another one. They all have roots in Taoist practice. And so like Taoism, what's interesting is it's not really a system like Buddhism would be. But they're not mutually exclusive, especially when Chan, which is Chinese Zen, comes into China. But like the Taoists have a very shamanic origin, and indigenous origin, and they end up syncretizing like Zen or like Chinese Zen Chan into it. But like, yeah, like a lot of the martial arts that I did had that in there. And I think like, for instance, like, when I was getting into like Buddhism and stuff like that, I couldn't really like comprehend, like, even though it's sort of like simple, like, oh yeah, Wu Wei means non-doing, so just kind of like, not put so much effort in it. But it's like more, I think like when you read like Lao Tzu, who's like the founder of like, or considered to be one of the proponents of what we could call Daoism. There's some scholarly like debates on that, if like we could like locate him as the founder, but just that there was just a systematic writing. But he's like quoting the I Ching, which is the Book of Changes, which is a divination tool, but also like where a lot of Taoist teachings are. But like principles of non-doing, yin and yang, passive and assertive, timing, all these things. Even like there's the apophatic aspect of the Tao kind of being like the name that is not the true name. It's very, I think, kind of like homologous with Christianity of the word. That's just my thing. But I guess like when it comes to my practice with these movements, because one, it is like to get better at martial arts. Also, there is a meditative function to it. I wouldn't say maybe I feel God in that moment, but I think the more I get into these flow states of like doing these slow different movements, that it does allow me to kind of actually center my thoughts and on the present. And then at the end, I do a standing. So all my meditation is done standing, holding a posture, whether it's like just standing with my hands on my lower belly, or like actually having them out like that, like I'm holding a ball, and I just like stay in that for like 10 to 15 minutes. I do kind of will, like, as I conclude, kind of start reciting like the prayers, like Hail Marys and stuff like that, in them. But yeah, like, I guess, like, I don't know if I could really give you a certain answer and say that like there's this connection I feel between God and the body. But I do think like, yeah, maybe that there is a way in which moving the body helps me kind of resonate with like, I guess, being attentive. And I think sometimes it is hard to be attentive and sit still. And I think when I'm moving the body in these choreographed ways, and especially with Tai Chi and Qigong, because they're specifically oriented not just for like martial arts. So like, here's the technicality: martial arts is not fighting. Martial art is just developing a skill. And same thing with the term kung fu or gong fu. It just means supreme skill from hard work. But you could be the supreme skill of hard work in combatives. But in the Chinese internal martial art, it's a kind of skill to align you with the Tao. So maybe in a sense that it is aligning me more with God, because I'm working on that skill at the same time while I'm moving my body. I guess, yeah. Now that I think about it, this one guy, the founder of Aikido, Morihei Shiba, you probably see me post the book a lot. It's called The Art of Peace. It's very just a bunch of different poems. Like, they're just small aphorisms. But like, he talks about like, the development of the true martial art is to develop compassion, benevolence, courage, and love for everyone. That's the true martial art.
I think that's
Aikido is literally just a Japanese way of just saying the Tao, the way, the gentle way. And so like, I guess like by like being gentle with the body and these movements that like, that you think are like, are intuitive, like, yeah, I just reach my arm like that. But yeah, you reached it fast, but like try with the more you do a movement slow with intent, and you realize like how much force that you actually do, that you have to learn how to kind of like be able to be like water, literally. And so in a sense, there is a meditation and attentiveness to committing to the phenomenon, but also like balancing with like not doing too much. And I think now that I've been talking about it and free associating, it's like in the same way, maybe we could apply that with prayer, of not forcing it, but make it be natural. But also with that comes repetition and practice. And the way that there is a wu way, there is a sort of effortless way. You're able to do it because you desire it, right? It's funny though, like this book popped in my head. I haven't read it yet, but I saw it on one of these Christian mystical pages on Facebook that I follow, The Eternal Tao, and it's an actual like synthesis of Christianity with Daoism. So
I've been wanting to read that book too. Yeah. It's funny that you're talking about this because somebody else, I like Thich Nhan Han a lot.
Oh, I love Thich Nhan Han. Yeah.
He also met Thomas Merton too, so it's like,
yeah, no, he's good.
Like,
yeah,
Thich Nhan Han is dope. He wrote Living Buddha, Living Christ.
Yeah. I haven't read that one. I've only read his one, which is like on the Four Noble Truths, was probably like my favorite one. Like he gives a very systematic overview of like the Buddhist teachings. Probably the best thing I would recommend anybody like new to Buddhism to read.
I gotta read that too. It's funny, I actually picked up one of his books on anger. I think I posted it, which was like surprisingly really good. And it's funny because actually I've been actually very curious about this. I don't know if you know, but I haven't actually found a lot of Christian books about anger, like how to deal with anger.
Yeah, that's actually kind of a good question. I'm pretty sure there are out there, but like most of like the stuff that you see like with a lot of like modern Christian literature is always like therapism or like self-help stuff. And it kind of just like, it becomes the more like trivial, just like you just are just, even though if you have the happy white picket fence, whatever, you just like are, trying to have more meaning in your love life or more meaning in like God. So it's like, there's no like deep, like philosophical or existential, like Christian works on anger. And I think really like what I do like about at least the Eastern side is the practical examination of human affects. Not to say that Christianity doesn't. I think in the mystical tradition there definitely is, and Mark talks a lot about that in the book that we mentioned, Directions of Desire, of affects and stuff like that. But I think like there is like something about like anger that really kind of does like inhibit us spiritually. Of course, anger and hate. But like I think really the Eastern philosophy, whether it's like Buddhism, Daoism, the Vedic tradition, really touch heavily on that side. I mean, I know like if you look at like the Upanishads, which probably like one of the like the Vedic texts that like is influential in my life the most, like that I just love to read. I think it's a beautiful piece of work. The Upanishads is just like living in the senses, right? And kind of like identifying with like your emotions, you or stuff like that. I do like a lot. The original Pali Sutras of Siddhartha, they go into depth a lot about like anger or like sadness or like just living in a worldview that's like too eternalistic or too nihilistic. So like looking for the middle way. I think that's definitely really helpful. Or like you can put it kind of like generically that you could see this is like a sort of Buddhist phenomenology or Buddhist psychology, but it's these texts by these Buddhists. They weren't really like monastics. they were kind of like a small band of philosophers that didn't last very long, but they called the Abhidharma, and they talk about the rising and cessation of consciousness, and these consciousness is like a sort of flux of impermanent states, and the aggregates of the mind and the fetters of the mind, these emotions are sort of these impermanent states, but that we cling to. And it's through the Dharma that we're able to realize the illusory of a sort of solidified consciousness. Really interesting text, very theoretical too. They end up getting critiqued by Nagarjuna in his text on the middle way, which, you know, the famous term of shunyata comes up, or emptiness, or the world is empty. You know, even emptiness is empty.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, because like, what is it? I got 2 books. It was the Healing Anger by Dalai Lama, and then Anger by Thich Nhan Han. And Thich Nhan Han was like very, very practical.
Yeah, he's just super down to earth too.
Super down to earth, which I love him for. The Healing Anger by Dalai Lama is actually super theoretical, but like it actually really helps, you know, because he's like using the Bodhisattva way by Shantideva. And Shantideva, I think, actually makes a pretty nasty argument on anger, which is, and it's, you know, I mean, for how old it is, I would say it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, which is to say, if anger is a part of if anger is natural, like it's a part of our disposition, then he was like, so why are we upset at the person that gets angry if it's natural, right? And then he goes, like, it's basically like being upset of fire burning you. That's how he describes it. It's like being upset because of fire doing what it does by its nature. And then he goes, but if anger is by accident, like if the clouds suddenly start getting cloudy and start raining, and it's by accident, he goes, that also doesn't make any sense for you to get upset if it's something accident. And so he's like comparing by nature and accident. He's basically saying, like, you know, it's still not worth being upset.
Yeah.
But even though these theoretical kind of, and he goes into like super in depth about, like, you know, talking, you know, why would you get upset if basically if you talk crap about someone, but you don't get upset about doing that, but you get upset when people talk about you. He's like, you see, like, there's a kind of contradiction there about, like, you're unbothered by talking about someone, but then you get upset when someone talks about you. And like, there's like kind of these very interesting rational arguments for anger that I found really helpful. But Thich Nhat Han was probably the most embodied, like, practical kind of solution to everything. But yeah, I mean, this is exactly why I appreciated Buddhism a lot, was the fact that they had very practical meditative things on the affects. And it made me think, like, actually I could quote a verse from Psalms right now that would basically be in line of like Thich Nhat Han kind of meditation on anger, which was, I think it's like Psalm 4, where it says, if you're disturbed, be silent. Actually, I think it says lay in your bed and be silent.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, just like to think about. But I mean, basically this whole idea of like silence, breathing, recentering yourself. And what was really surprising me was Thich Nhat Han was like, yeah, this is what it means to take care of your anger.
Yeah. It's funny because like Thich Nhat Han also comes from the Zen tradition. And that's what I really like about Zen and Daoism the most, is that like they're so minimalist on the level of like theory, but there's still a praxis to it, and one that may seem simple and intuitive by nature, but is actually really hard. And one of the things is like the hardest thing that to do in Zen would just be to sit, you know, because when we sit, we're thinking about a lot of things, or like, you know, or especially like if we do a task, we're not doing just the task. There are many things that we're doing with the task, whether we're multitasking or we're like not putting our awareness and our attention into it. And so to bring it into like the religious practice, it's like the attention and the right amount of effort to do the work to get the effect. And just to sit and master sitting is very hard, because what you put your attention on, you know? And so it being in that moment of just mastering sitting is Zen 101, or the ultimate achievement of Zen. It's not to like desire to reach some state of bliss, but it's like in that thing, it's like you cease being disturbed about the question that made you do the thing to begin with, right? And that's why like Zen koans are in the same way. They give you this riddles, and so like you focus on the koan by sitting there. That's the only thing. If you're not just sitting there, you're at least meditating on the koan. You're contemplating on it, but you're mastering sitting while you are tethering with this paradoxical statement.
Right, and that's what I've always liked.
And
I actually got in this conversation with someone today, actually, where they were, you know, kind of being critical about certain concepts, but I was like, well, you know, and I'm pretty sure you would understand this too, where it's like some of these Buddhist concepts, Taoist concepts, just Eastern religious concepts, they're not too much into refining the concepts. That's not like the point. The point is in the praxis itself that you start to understand what they mean by the concepts. So it's actually completely backwards.
Yeah.
Right? Like we can't. I mean, that was kind of like one of the things that I'm always critical about, because it seems like we're using our kind of Greek Christian heritage on debate and argument to rhetoric, basically to get to the truth of something, when in reality, a lot of the Eastern religions, they completely approach it from the opposite way. It's more like you try it first and then you tell me if I'm wrong.
Right.
So it's completely like just counterintuitive when we talk about things like for example, like even when I think about the Wu Wei, I don't understand it at all, but I'm pretty sure you would have a better understanding of Wu Wei because of the amount of praxis you've been doing in that sense. Like you would have a more intuitive understanding of Wu Wei. You may not be able to give me like a nice simple explanation where I even understand what it means and then I could just do it. But you would have a kind of understanding of just like, yeah, there is something about Wu Wei that is not just passive. And so that's what I've always found interesting about a lot of like Buddhism, Daoism, even Hinduism, is just like their concepts, from a philosophical point of view, they're kind of lazy, but at the same time, they have a lot of purpose in them because they're supposed to be didactic. They're didactic concepts, not concepts that we can just slice and dice. But in philosophy, we tend to slice and dice first before we try out the concept.
Yeah, I would say that there is still like the sort of approach to the Eastern philosophy, and you know, let's not like get too like Orientalist, you know, to say there's a difference between Eastern and the West. No, I think besides the point that you made about like let's do it first and then talk about it later, I still think that there is a rigor, but to them that's philosophical and you could say academic, but like the theory is in the chants. It's written like, you know, like these things are actually supposed to be chanted. So like the sutras, the Upanishads, they're meant to be recited as chants. But they contain theory in them. So that's the one thing. And yeah, like I would say, yeah, like Wu Wei is just like doing just the thing that you have to do and nothing more. So like if you're hungry, so you eat, but you're not like eating worrying about like, you know, other things or like being on your phone. It's just doing that task. And it's like, it's just as simple as that. Like in the Taoism, you'll always see the references to nature. So like, you know, the water's moving and it conforms to the riverbed. You know, that's Wu Wei. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't impede on its own determination. In the sense, we impede on ourselves.
Yes.
So that would be, so Wu Wei would be like learning how to like do the task at hand, or do, what we want or desiring, and like not impede ourselves. And I mean, I think like with Taoist or the Taoist practices, it's like always rooted in the practice, and like Wu Wei is always aligned with of the martial art. So like the Tai Chi being all like effortless movement, there's a Wu Wei in which like, oh, when I did this movement, I realized that I flexed my bicep. So that's not Wu Wei because I did too much effort. If I'm just reaching like that, if I'm just doing cloud hands, then I'm just moving this and letting the torso move as the body mechanics intends me to be, so that I could be graceful but yet solid at the same time, yin yang. How I'm so active right here but passive down here, or I'm so passive right here but yet I'm so active right here. I'm very yang on the bottom but yin right here. That's, and again, like how Wu Wei operates. And I start to think like getting into like the internal martial arts, when some of these phrases that Lao Tzu would use, like soft conquers hardness. He's talking about movements in Tai Chi. He's talking about movements in these Neigong practices of internal alchemy.
And it's interesting when you connect it to like Jesus saying like when they hit you, give them the other cheek. Right? Because that's like, that would be like kind of doing something like Wu Wei, where you're using the softness in response to the hardness, right? Like that. And it's very interesting that a lot of Jesus's statements kind of respond in a kind of yin yang kind of manner, but on the level of virtue, essentially.
Like a virtue. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that I do like. Again, I forgot to touch on, but you had mentioned this is like virtue. The importance of virtue is definitely important. I think with virtue though, and like, even though we mentioned like, back to our other point about anger, I do think like, I think it's like with the emphasis of virtue and practice that like you're able to kind of dispel yourself from these sort of emotions or affects that really inhibit your well-being, or your eudaimonia, or whatever term you want to use, or keep you closed from grace. But like the more that you practice, the more that like you start to reflect on yourself, and the need to not resort to anger or petty trivial things. I think that, of course, that is more explicit in the practice of vipassana, of mindful attention, and compassion meditation in Buddhism. But I think like it's just something that is like a byproduct over time in the practice of prayer life in Christianity. But I think it's like when you get angry or you feel like, you were like disturbed, it's like confession, prayer, talk to God about it, which I think with the emphasis of attention and silence, I think like these contemplative things ultimately have been sort of forgotten. And like this sort of emphasis of experience, of feeling, the saturation of having to feel things or sense things, kind of keep us from these important practices that are negative, that there's a radical negativity to it, the apophatic nature to it, that changes you when you add that element in, when you add that orientation, I should say, that framework, not of sort of positivism, of saturating, of experience, or thinking like of the mystical as some subset of experience, or the experience of all experiences. No, it's not an experience. It's rather the sort of truth that emerges from this practice, from this contemplative practice, this contemplative reflection dialogue.
Right. I mean, like it's funny because I've never been more convinced of the idea of virtue until I started doing these practices. Basically, I was like, oh, I do believe in these things because it actually makes sense. and I feel like my experience has like some testimony to them. Versus like if I was just philosophically slicing virtue, I'd be like, well, there's a flaw in virtue and so on and so on. But like a lot of the arguments that even Buddhism kind of poses is like we interfere with ourselves. So you could actually tap into like an unlimited compassion, right? A boundless compassion. Maybe in the Christian sense, it would be like you could tap into like the spirit of God, so to speak. If you are able to cultivate a kind of practice, of course, it's like you wouldn't be able to have unlimited compassion all the time and so on, but it's just the striving of the fact that actually it's there. It's like kind of like Buddha nature kind of thing. Like it's there, right? Or the presence of the spirit is there. So that's why I'll have to start cutting this conversation, but I was when I was in my sociology class, they were talking about how doing good deeds have limits because fundamentally when the ego is not able to get any more satisfaction, it's hard to continue doing good things.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the argument, right? That was like, we have a limited compassion. We have a limited altruism is fundamentally limited because of this ego deprivation that it kind of goes through. If it's not being, basically, if it's no longer rewarding, if the patient is too demanding, if no one is thanking you, if nobody is,
right.
And on the level of virtue, though, and all these practices, the point of the practices is to get yourself out of the way so that way you can continue the work.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's interesting about it. So in some sense, even the arguments for altruism is actually extremely limited because of even the critiques against altruism is extremely limited because fundamentally they're forgetting about the argument of virtue and praxis that is rooted in religious understanding. And because everybody's thinking that, I think maybe we've moralized ego too much, and that's why they push back on this. But I remember a lot of arguments in my class about, well, the ego's good because who cares if they had different intentions? They still did, like, they still gave $1 million to the poor or whatever. Like, the intentions doesn't matter as much as the kind of action.
And I think too, like, there's also just a sort of philosophical conflation of like, moralism or what is it, egoism versus altruism.
Mm-hmm.
Because of human nature, but like that doesn't really explain human nature really at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the domain of like understanding the distinction between the ontological and the ethical. I think like that's like a sort of core thing that like non-philosophical people make in terms of like ethics, especially when they just reduce it to altruism or like egoism. But like I get what you're like saying, but like and like ultimately I agree with everything you're saying. Like like religion's like, no, we have to like overcome the ego to realize that like if we fall into just like the sort of self-interested thing, we're realizing that we are against our own self-interest, even if we want our own selfish needs. It's like we end up not getting that, and we're just as like unsatisfied and unhappy as the one who's altruistic and ends up feeling no reward from like the repetition. I mean, I think just like, even to put it in another lens, like psychoanalysis teaches us this too,
Okay.
The alterity or the otherness of our subjectivity, it's rooted in the other. So it's like, it's neither this pure altruism or this pure selfishness. It's our symptom is a sort of otherness. And so we're dealing with the other. I mean, it goes back to like the failure. I mean, like even in a non-psychoanalytic sense, like Hegel talks about this too, with the failures of recognition, but like also like striving for recognition.
Yeah, with the master slave.
Yeah.
No, I always loved that argument. But yeah, it's like the self-forgetting That's the point. Like, you're
Yeah.
not supposed to be aware of you. If you're aware of yourself doing good, if you're going, oh yeah, I'm doing good, I'm doing good, I'm doing good, you're already like basically effing yourself over. Because the moment something bad happens, the moment something negative happens,
Right.
either you'll be like, oh, okay, I'm not doing good anymore, or I can't do this anymore, or this person's an a-hole or whatever. You've already have brought yourself up into this hyper conscious mode of a kind of ethical mode that fundamentally deters you from doing anything else, versus if you're in a complete state of self-forgetting, you're not thinking good or bad. Am I doing good or bad? It is this kind of like, maybe like wu wei, or the other word that I like is just kind of like non-dualism.
Yeah.
Non-dual. You're in a mode of non-dualism. It's this full self-forgetting. You're not thinking in this either or hyper conscious awareness.
Right.
And that's kind of like the level of virtue that fundamentally all these practices are striving for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree 100%.
All right. Well, if there's anything else, Andrew, this is really good talk, man.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else to say. That was really good. Yeah, really, really insightful and just like enlightening, just to just flesh out just cool ideas and talk about, interest in religion. And it just went all over the place. Went from like a bit of psychoanalysis, a bit to like religion, contemplation, Karatani, Kant,
Yeah.
And then,
I mean, I told you, I'm gonna frame it this way, but I'm always down to like associate from wherever we pick up from.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you want to plug in like your channel,
yeah,
doing.
Yeah, so again, the channel is the Vanishing Mediators on YouTube. You could find us on there. And then like what we're doing right now is concluding our series on Seminar 3, and we're going into Seminar 4. On my personal channel, I'm working on, or just my personal project that I'm going to be promoting on both the Vanishing Mediators, but mainly on my own, is a project I'm doing on Seminar 16, which is inspired by the study group with Daniel Tutt, where we went over Seminar 16. And because it is a Marxist study group, the emphasis of Lacan's sort of relation to Marxism and his interest in Marx. And that inspired me to go back to reading Seminar 16. I just recently had a conversation with Daniel Tutt, which you could see both on my personal channel on YouTube called the Big Sig or on the Vanishing Mediators. They're both the same. One just has a cooler thumbnail and an intro, which would be on the Vanishing Mediators channel than my own. And it just talks about, Lacan's critique of May 68, his reinvention of the Marxist intellectual, and what we could learn from Lacan as thinkers in emancipatory politics, thinkers in Marxism. And he concludes that like he has something to teach us because he is like Socrates. He's a gadfly, a fly that lands on the horse that annoys them, but in a way where they can't swat him or get him away. He just stuck on there. So Lacan is like a gadfly to Marxist, but a productive one. And so that got me thinking, and I want to kind of sort of expand on that and go back to Seminar 16 and do some projects on that will be on the channel. So look forward to that. Yeah, that's all I got.
Well, thanks. I mean, well, you guys heard it. You guys can follow Andrew through the Vanishing Mediators and then his personal channel, the Big Sig, the Big Sigarelli.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, man, this was a great talk. I like talking God with you.
Yeah.
So, all right, guys. See you guys later. Thank you guys for watching.